Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Byrne, thank you for your presence here and your willingness to serve our veterans and serve our country. Let me outline for you a set of facts and ask for how you would handle this circumstance. The facts as I know them is that Senator Tester and I introduced legislation dealing with providing hearing aid specialists within the VA. This question is more than just about hearing aid specialists. It's about a process or a way that the VA responds to members of Congress and whether or not they abide by the law as passed. So in 2016, legislation was signed into law requiring that the VA establish standards for hearing aid specialists and then hiring them into the VA. Last March, so 3.5 years later, the Secretary was in front of this committee, and I asked, in fact, I reminded the Secretary that the VA has not established those standards as the law requires, nor has it hired any hearing aid specialists. Of course, that resulted in a commitment from the Secretary and his team that they would be back in touch with us and we would receive a briefing on what was transpiring on this issue. Shortly thereafter, I received a written response that said, quote, "Given that the VA has no plans to use its discretionary authority to hire hearing aid specialists, we are uncertain how such a briefing would be useful." So we went from the law being passed, a requirement, that the VA act in a certain manner. We went to a conversation with the folks at the VA in a hearing setting in which I would be briefed, to we're not going to hire any specialists, so there's no reason to brief you. How would you handle that circumstance in your new position? Is there a better way of doing that? And do you understand how the law requires, when the law requires the VA to do something, that it does it?
I'm very clear on that as a lawyer and as a leader within the federal government. So if your law that you passed is very clear that we're required to do something, we certainly will. I'm not sure how to answer it beyond that. If it's required, it's required. If it's optional, that's a different discussion.
Absolutely, it's a different discussion. However, that discussion can't occur or won't occur because the VA says it's not of benefit to them to have such a conversation with me.
That's not acceptable. We'll have that. I will give you assurances. We'll look into this. We'll have that dialogue, and we'll comply with the law. That's not. There's no wiggle room or gray area in that, sir.
Mr. Byrne, first of all, I know that you would answer the question. You will comply with the law, and I appreciate that. And I'm not trying to put you in an awkward position, but I've been on the Veterans Committee for 23 years now, and one of the things that I think is important is for the VA to implement laws as passed by Congress. I don't think it's just the VA. I think that's the nature of our constitutional system of government. And on too many instances over 23 years, I've seen where the VA has found ways to avoid doing what Congress has directed them to do. And so this is a much broader issue for me. I'm not intending to put you in a position. I have great regard for Secretary Wilkie, too. I'm not trying to put you in a position between answering my question and being in an uncomfortable position with what he committed to do to me. But I want to hear from you that you are committed not only to the law, which I would expect you to say, but that so many times nominees come before our committee, and of course, and it's generally in this case, it's generally the Democrat side is asking, well, will you deal with us? Will you make certain that we're briefed and that you respond to our questions? I just want to, again, highlight how important it is for the VA to have a relationship built on trust and cooperation between me and my colleagues as members of Congress and you and your colleagues at the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Most certainly, sir. You have my full commitment to that.
Thank you very much. Let me ask, in the short time I have left, although I don't know who we're going to next, Mr. Chairman, the issue of Mission Act. Let me just mention a couple of things. I am hopeful that there is a field manual so that the VA personnel in the field who are actually implementing the Mission Act know what the what the mission is. That's it. Well, thank you, Johnny. What the mission is. And too many times, again, this is an experience that I've had with the VA. The answers that I receive here, what I see as the policy, what I see as the direction, is not understood or implemented by folks who actually are doing the work in Kansas and across the country. So I would encourage, we've been told that there will be, we've never seen a field manual, but we think the staff at the VA in the field need to understand. I always say this, mostly what I do in regard to veterans issues is what is influenced by what I call casework, what members of Congress do in trying to solve problems of their constituents. And VA casework is a significant component of what we do. In this week's report, there was a veteran who called our office to say he needed community care. The VA told him that the Choice Act has expired and that the Mission Act hadn't been implemented, and therefore there was no community care for him available. None of that, of course, makes any sense. We had community care before we had choice. We have community care today, but it is how do we translate what is the law, how we translate what is the policy at VA Central to the folks who are actually dealing with the veterans on a day-to-day basis. So I would encourage you to pursue making certain that that information, whatever it's called, a field manual of some kind, is clearly available and understood. I had the VISN folks from Kansas City, from our VISN in the office yesterday. They are indicating that the training is going exceptionally well. I think this is one of the best experiences in training VA employees in the field, and I'm very pleased to hear that and to see their delight, their enthusiasm for the way this is going. But again, I would highlight the distinction that often happens between what is said here and what is said back home in Kansas or across the country. One of the other pieces of casework that appeared recently is this. A patient and a provider reached a conclusion that it was in the best interest of a veteran to go outside the VA for that care and treatment. That decision was overturned by the hospital director. And I would again highlight what the law says. Once the provider and the veteran make a determination of what's in the best interest of the veteran, that is the decision. It's not something that works its way up the chain of command. Mission Act will only work if there's a relationship that is solid and viable between the provider and the patient. And so I highlight again, and maybe that's related to my manual question, is even perhaps the higher level of VA employees need to know what the process is for making a determination about what's in the best interest of a veteran. And finally, and I'll try to conclude real quickly, Mr. Chairman, we've requested a claims processing information sheet. It's the same, I'm beating the same drum. Our providers need the same kind of education and information. The VA has been very helpful to us. We've had the Kansas Hospital Association and others who have meetings. We've had VA personnel present to have workshops and forums about implementation of the Mission Act. But as I've seen many times, there are difficulties in the veteran knowing what he or she is entitled to, difficulty in knowing what it's difficult for the employee of the VA to know what he or she is able to offer. It's also confusing, and particularly in light of the slowness in payment and the difficulty in being in network with choice, we need to make sure that the providers now know the opportunities are different and the circumstances for prompt payment, episode of care, all those things are different than it was under choice. So there's a lot of education to be done in addition to the two categories I previously mentioned, but also with our hospitals, our doctors, our rural health clinics. Mr. Byrne, anything I said that doesn't make sense to you?
No, sir, I think you're spot on.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.